The terminal lights home over empty floor as the first passenger sip coffee and head the departure aboard. Ground crews finish their routines, full lines disconnect, cargo doors lock, and the aircraft waits at the gate, ready for a flight no one will remember. But two names on the schedule never become two bodies in the cockpit. No buzzer scan, no security footage, no late arrival. Just park cars outside in the cockpit, the stays dark. Minutes turn into an official delay. Tena cancellation, while the runway stays silent. In a place buoyed on checklist and confirmation, one ordinary morning loses its most basic proof. The people were supposed to show up.
The morning arrived without drama, the kind of morning that promised routine and delivered reassurance. Dawn spread itself thin across the tarmac, a pale wash of color barely strong enough to soften the hard lines of concrete and steel. At the regional airport, the day began the way it always did, with quiet purpose. Lights hummed inside the terminal, casting long reflections across polished floors. A janitor pushed a cart down an empty corridor. Somewhere in the distance, a radio murmured weather updates that no one was truly listening to. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. On the runway, an aircraft waited patiently, its body cool to the touch, its windows dark and unreadable. Ground crews moved around it with practiced efficiency, their motions unhurried, almost meditative. Fuel lines were checked, cargo doors sealed, clipboards passed from hand to hand. This flight was not special. It wasn't historic or risky or noteworthy. It was simply another scheduled departure on another ordinary morning, the kind of flight that disappeared into the background of daily life the moment it landed somewhere else. Inside the terminal, the gate area slowly stirred. A few early passengers arrived carrying coffee and newspapers, their faces still shaped by sleep. Some glanced at the departure board. Others stared through the glass at the waiting plane, imagining themselves already airborne, suspended above whatever they were trying to leave behind. The atmosphere was calm, predictable, safe. Airports are built on trust. Trust that systems work, that professionals show up, that routines hold. Two men were expected to walk through security and down the jet bridge that morning. They had done it hundreds of times before. Their names were already printed on internal schedules, quietly confirming that the cockpit would be occupied by experience rather than chance. These were not rookies or stand-ins. They were pilots with history, men whose presence alone reassured ground staff that the day would proceed without incident. The aircraft was ready. The passengers were assembling. Time moved forward. And yet, as minutes passed, something subtle shifted. At first, no one noticed. There was no alarm, no announcement, no sudden break in rhythm. Flights rarely run exactly on time. Delays are expected, absorbed without panic. A supervisor glanced at a watch and then at a clipboard, assuming the pilots were en route from the parking lot or finishing a conversation somewhere out of sight. Someone joked about traffic. Someone else shrugged. The machinery of departure continued to turn, unaware that a crucial part was missing. But time has a way of revealing absence. A ground crew member asked quietly if the cockpit had checked in. The answer came back vague, uncertain. A phone was lifted, then set down. A second glance at the schedule produced a faint crease of concern, quickly smoothed over by habit. These men were reliable. They would arrive. They always did. The gate agent made a soft announcement about a brief delay, her voice smooth and practiced, offering no cause for worry. Passengers shifted in their seats. A child pressed a face against the glass. Outside, the aircraft remained motionless, engine silent, waiting for hands that did not come. As the minutes stretched longer, routine began to fray. Someone walked the length of the terminal, looking for familiar faces. Someone else checked the break room, then a restroom, then another corridor. The airport, usually a place defined by movement, seemed to hold its breath. Each passing moment deepened a quiet, unspoken question. Where are they? There were no frantic phone calls yet. No emergency procedures triggered. Just a growing awareness that something ordinary had failed to happen. The pilots had not checked in. They had not been seen at security. No one remembered passing them in the parking lot. It was as if they had paused just outside the frame of the morning and never stepped into view. By now, The plane should have been boarding. Instead, the gate remained still. Passengers began to exchange glances, irritation flickering at the edges of patience. The delay was still explained as minor, temporary. No one wanted to imagine anything else. Airports are places where explanations are expected, where every pause has a reason. The idea that there might be none felt unreasonable, almost offensive. Behind the scenes, concerns sharpened. Security logs were pulled. Names were checked and rechecked. Radios crackled with questions that had no answers. The realization settled slowly, heavily, like fog. The pilots had not entered the building at all. They had not arrived late. They had not arrived. What made the moment unsettling was not panic, but disbelief. This wasn't the kind of problem airports prepared for. Weather delays, mechanical issues, even emergencies had scripts. This did not. Two professionals scheduled, trusted, accountable, had simply failed to appear. No call, no message, no warning. The aircraft sat ready, its doors closed, its systems primed for flight that would never happen. The runway stretched out ahead, empty and indifferent, outside the terminal windows. The sky was widening into full morning, bright and unconcerned. For the first time, someone used a word they hadn't wanted to say out loud. Missing. It landed awkwardly in the air, heavier than it should have been. Missing suggested time passing, without resolution. It suggested waiting. It suggested stories that do not end cleanly. And yet, there was no other word that fit. The passengers were eventually asked to disembark. Apologies were offered. Alternate arrangements were discussed. Life for them adjusted and moved on. But within the airport, something had shifted permanently. A line had been crossed without ceremony, without spectacle. A day that had begun like any other had quietly broken from expectation. There was no sign of struggle. No note, no indication that anything was wrong. Just two empty spaces where certainty should have been. As the morning continued, the airport resumed its rhythm. Other flights departed. Other crews arrived. Announcements echoed and faded. But beneath the surface, an unease lingered, subtle but unmistakable. The knowledge that routine had failed, that two men had vanished not in the dark of night or the chaos of crisis, but in the safety of an ordinary morning, left a crack in the sense of order everyone relied on. The flight never took off. The runway remained untouched by its wheels. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of the airport, a story began without witnesses, without clarity, and without an ending anyone could yet imagine. They were not the kind of men whose absence made sense. That was the detail that troubled everyone most once the initial shock faded. Disappearances often come with edges, fractures in behavior, whispers of instability, debts, addictions, secrets. But these men existed firmly inside the lines. Their lives were structured, predictable, built around checklists and procedures that rewarded consistency and punished deviation. If there was a category for people least likely to vanish without explanation, airline pilots would sit near the top. Both men had spent years earning the trust of the system they worked within. Aviation is unforgiving of carelessness, and neither of them had built a career by taking chances. They were known quantities. Their records were clean. Evaluations were steady, unremarkable in the best possible way. They arrived on time, followed protocol, and treated flying not as a thrill, but as a responsibility. In an industry obsessed with risk mitigation, they were the mitigation. Colleagues described them in the language of routine. Dependable, calm, professional. Not the loudest voices in the room, not the ones who chase attention. They were the kind of crew members you barely noticed because nothing ever went wrong when they were around. That quiet reliability, so comforting in the air, now became deeply unsettling on the ground. In the weeks before the flight, nothing had seemed out of place. No disciplinary actions. No sudden schedule changes. No heated arguments overheard in crew rooms. One had recently completed a standard medical clearance, passing without issue. The other had logged hours the way he always did, methodically, without gaps. If stress existed, it was the ordinary kind that came with work, mortgages, families, and aging bodies, not the kind that announces catastrophe. Their personal lives, too, resisted the shape of mystery. One was a husband who followed predictable rituals at home, the kind that anchored a household. He left notes when he traveled, checked in when he landed, remembered birthdays. He had talked recently about mundane plans, home repairs, an upcoming vacation, the slow accumulation of responsibilities that suggested a future, not an escape. The night before the flight, his conversation with his spouse had been forgettable in the way that later becomes painful. No arguments, no confessions, just a promise to call when he arrived. The other had a similar gravity to his life. He was close to his family, known for reliability rather than drama. He maintained long friendships, the kind built over decades, not months. His routines were so consistent that people could describe his habits without thinking about it. Where he parked, how early he arrived, what he drank before a flight. He was not impulsive. He was not secretive. If he had been planning to disappear, it would have required a complete reinvention of who he was. And yet, both men were gone. When investigators began reconstructing their final days, the absence of warning signs became its own kind of evidence. Bank accounts showed no unusual activity. There were no large withdrawals, no emptied savings. Credit cards remained untouched after the morning they vanished. Passports were still where they belonged. Luggage was unremarkable, packed for a routine flight, not a life reset. These were not men who had prepared for a long absence. Their cars told a similar story. Parked where they normally parked. Locked, nothing out of place. No signs of struggle. No notes left behind on dashboards or seats. The vehicles looked abandoned only in retrospect, transformed into artifacts by the knowledge that their owners would never return to claim them. Friends were questioned gently at first, then more thoroughly. Had either man seemed distracted, withdrawn, unhappy? The answers were frustratingly consistent. They had been themselves. Tired sometimes, irritated occasionally, but present, engaged, planning for the future in small, ordinary ways. The kind of planning that assumes tomorrow will arrive. What made the situation feel wrong was not just the disappearance itself, but the lack of narrative. There was no obvious story to tell about why this happened. No cracks to widen. No secrets waiting to be uncovered. In true crime stories, meaning often emerges from contrast between who someone appeared to be and who they truly were. Here, there was only alignment. These men were exactly who everyone thought they were. Even the idea that they might have disappeared together felt implausible. Pilots often share cockpits, but rarely share lives beyond work. Their relationship was professional, not intimate. Friendly, but not inseparable. They were not bound by ideology or desperation or grievance. There was no shared cause that might have pulled them off the map in tandem. The odds are too independent. Stable men choosing the same moment to vanish stretched credibility thin. As days passed, their identities began to blur under the pressure of speculation. People searched for meaning where none had existed before. A passing comment was re-examined. A tired expression was reinterpreted. Innocuous details were rearranged into patterns that felt convincing only because the alternative, that there was no warning at all, was too unsettling to accept. Families resisted this reframing. They clung to the men they knew, not the versions being quietly rewritten by absence. To them, the disappearance was not a twist in character, but a rupture in reality. These men did not abandon. They did not flee. They did not erase themselves. Something had interrupted their lives mid-sentence. The weight of that interruption settled heavily on those left behind. Children asked questions that had no answers. Spouses replayed final conversations, searching for hidden meanings that were never there. The most painful realization was not that something had been missed, but that nothing had been missed at all. The disappearance had not announced itself. It had simply happened. Within the airline, their absence created an unspoken unease. Schedules were adjusted. Names were removed from future rosters. Lockers were cleared quietly, respectfully. But the sense lingered that if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. Professionalism, it seemed, was no shield against vanishing. In the end, what defined these men was not mystery, but contradiction. They lived lives that pointed forward, yet left no trace of where they went. They followed rules, yet slipped beyond the reach of every system designed to track them. They were visible, documented, accounted for, until suddenly they were not. And that was what made their disappearance so disturbing. Not the drama of it, but the calm. Not the chaos, but the order that preceded it. These were men who were never supposed to vanish. And because of that, their absence felt less like an event and more like a flaw in the world itself. Confusion did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, carried on small, almost forgettable moments that only later revealed their importance. In the first hour after the pilots failed to appear, the airport still trusted in explanation. Delays had a way of resolving themselves. Phones rang, voices overlapped, and people continued moving as though the missing pieces would simply fall back into place if given enough time. Supervisors checked watches and schedules again, convinced they had overlooked something simple. Perhaps the pilots had been reassigned and the message hadn't traveled properly. Perhaps there was a mix-up with gates or terminals. The assumption was not that something had gone wrong, but that information had failed to circulate. Airports are systems built on coordination, and when something stalls, the instinct is to search for the miscommunication, not the disaster. Calls were made to crew dispatch, then to crew scheduling. Each call ended the same way, with a pause, a clarification, a repeated spelling of names. No one had heard from them. No one had logged a delay. No one had received a message explaining absence. The answers were polite, professional, and increasingly tense. A supervisor's tone changed slightly, the first audible sign that uncertainty was becoming concern. Someone was sent to the parking lot. It was a routine step taken without drama. Pilots were sometimes delayed by traffic, especially on early morning drives. A walk through the lot might catch them hurrying toward the terminal, uniforms pressed, bags swinging at their sides. Instead, the cars were already there, parked neatly, in familiar spots, engines cold, doors locked. Nothing suggested a rushed arrival or an abrupt departure. The sight should have been reassuring. They had at least made it to the airport, but instead, it deepened the unease. If they had arrived, then where were they? Security was notified, cautiously at first. Logs were pulled, entry points reviewed, cameras scanned. The records were clean in the way that made no sense at all. There was no footage of the men entering the terminal, no badge scans, no recorded passage through security. It was as if they had reached the edge of the airport and then dissolved. Inside, the delay stretched longer than anyone felt comfortable admitting. Gate agents kept their voices calm, offering revised departure estimates that quietly slid forward in 15-minute increments. Passengers grew restless, but still unconcerned. Delays were part of the contract of air travel. No one imagined that the reason involved two missing pilots. The truth remained contained behind closed doors, moving from desk to desk in low voices. As more staff became aware of the situation, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations dropped in volume. Radios crackled more frequently. People began to stand instead of sit, as though readiness itself might summon answers. Someone asked if hospitals had been called. Another wondered about car accidents on nearby roads. Theories formed and dissolved within minutes, each one disproven by the same absence of evidence. Phones rang at home addresses. Voicemails were left, polite at first, then more urgent. Each unanswered ring chipped away at the assumption that this was a minor disruption. There were no callbacks, no explanations, just silence stretching thin and tight. The realization came without ceremony. The pilots had not checked in anywhere, not at the airport, not with their families, not with their employer. In a profession defined by check-ins, logs, confirmation, and redundancy, their complete lack of signal felt almost impossible. The system was designed to notice deviations. And yet, here was a deviation so complete it appeared as nothing at all. By mid-morning, the word delay no longer fit. The flight was officially canceled. Passengers were rerouted, compensated, apologized to. Their inconvenience, though frustrating, remained temporary. For the people behind the scenes, time had begun to stretch in a different way, thick with implication. Airport security initiated internal protocols that few ever witnessed. Doors were checked, maintenance areas swept, restrooms inspected, storage rooms opened. Each search produced the same result: Nothing. No discarded belongings. No signs of struggle. No indication that the men had ever been there. The absence was not chaotic. It was precise. Local authorities were contacted, framed initially as a welfare concern rather than an emergency. 2 adults, last seen driving to work, unaccounted for. The tone remained measured, controlled. There was still hope that this would resolve itself with a late discovery or an overlooked detail. But as hours passed, the case quietly changed shape. Investigators asked for timelines. When were they last seen? Who spoke to them last? The answers pointed backward, away from the airport, into ordinary domestic spaces. A driveway, a kitchen table, a familiar goodbye. The trail ended not in a dramatic location, but in routine. By the afternoon, concern had fully hardened into alarm. Missing persons reports were filed. Descriptions circulated. Patrol cars scanned nearby roads. Hospitals were contacted. Nothing surfaced. The pilots had vanished into the gap between home and cockpit, a stretch of time so small it felt almost insulting to call a mystery. Inside the airport, staff returned to their duties, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Conversations replayed themselves in people's minds. The moment someone should have noticed, the assumption that it delayed action, the quiet confidence that now felt misplaced. The airport, usually a place of constant departures, had become the site of a disappearance no one could quite explain. What made the first hour so disorienting was not fear, but the absence of chaos. There were no alarms blaring, no frantic chases, no dramatic interruptions. The day continued around the missing men, as though the world had decided not to acknowledge their absence. Flights landed. Baggage carousels turned. Announcements echoed and faded. Life, indifferent and relentless, moved forward. And yet, beneath that motion, something fundamental had broken. The question that lingered was not where they had gone, but how they had managed to disappear so completely, so quietly, without triggering the systems designed to prevent exactly that. The first hours offered no answers, only a growing sense that whatever had happened did not fit within the boundaries of expectation. By nightfall, hope had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer the casual hope of a delayed arrival. It was a strained, fragile hope that clings to uncertainty because the alternative is too heavy to hold. The airport lights glowed against the dark, illuminating empty corridors and silent gates. Somewhere beyond them, 2 lives had slipped out of reach, leaving behind nothing but questions and the unsettling knowledge that the ordinary can fail without warning. The search began with confidence, the kind that comes from believing effort will be rewarded. Once the word missing was no longer tentative, the machinery of response activated in earnest. Law enforcement officers arrived with notebooks and measured voices. Search protocols were discussed. Maps were unfolded across tables. There was a sense, at least in the beginning, that this was a problem of coverage rather than mystery. If enough ground was searched, if enough questions were asked, the men would be found somewhere just beyond the edge of attention. Dogs were brought in, their handlers moving with quiet purpose through parking lots and access roads. The animals worked methodically, noses low, tracing invisible stories written in scent. They paused where the pilot's car sat, circled, and then hesitated, confused. The trails did not lead forward. They did not lead anywhere at all. It was as if the scent simply stopped, cut cleanly from a world. Nearby motels were checked, one by one. Clerks flipped through registers. Names were scanned for familiar signatures. Security footage was reviewed where available. Grainy images replayed at half speed. No sightings emerged. No figures resembling the pilots passed through lobbies or hallways. The rooms remained occupied by other lives, other stories, all unrelated. Roads leading away from the airport were canvassed. Officers asked questions at gas stations, convenience stores, diners open early enough to serve truck drivers and shift workers. Had anyone seen 2 men in pilot uniforms? Had anyone noticed anything unusual that morning? The answers were polite, apologetic, and unhelpful. No one remembered them. No one recalled anything out of place. Search teams moved into nearby wooded areas, places where accidents sometimes hid themselves from immediate view. They combed through brush and undergrowth, eyes trained for signs of disturbance. Footprints, broken branches, discarded items. The land offered nothing. It stood unchanged, indifferent to the urgency brought into it. Helicopters were considered, then deployed. From above, the world flattened into patterns of green and gray. Fields, roads, rooftops, rivers. Nothing indicated struggle or crash or concealment. The search expanded outward, radius by radius, each widening circle reinforcing the same truth. There was nothing to find. What made the effort so unsettling was not resistance, but cooperation. The environment did not hide clues behind difficulty. It simply did not contain them. Every place searched answered the same way, with silence. Inside the investigation, frustration grew quietly. Leads were written down and crossed out almost as quickly. Tips came in, spurred by early media mentions. Someone thought they had seen one of the pilots in another town. Someone claimed to recognize a face in a passing crowd. Each tip was followed, each one dissolved under scrutiny. Faces blurred, memories shifted, certainty evaporated. The absence of physical evidence became its own problem. There were no dropped wallets, no torn clothing, no abandoned luggage. Nothing suggested violence. Nothing suggested escape. The men had not left a trail. They had left a void. In investigative terms, it was the worst possible scenario. No starting point. No direction. Time pressed forward, transforming urgency into endurance. Searchers returned to places already checked, hoping fatigue had caused them to miss something. They slowed their pace, narrowed their focus. Still nothing. The landscape remained unchanged, offering no acknowledgement that 2 lives were unaccounted for. Families waited nearby, their presence heavy and quiet. They watched people move in and out of rooms, listened to radios crackle with coded language, and tried to interpret expressions for meaning. Each passing hour without news became harder to endure. The initial belief that the men would be found confused, injured, delayed, began to thin, replaced by a more fragile hope that resisted articulation. As daylight faded, artificial light took over. Flashlights cut narrow beams through darkness. The search did not stop, but its rhythm changed. Night reshaped the world, making distances feel longer, spaces more ominous. Every shadow suggested possibility, then resolved into nothing. When morning came again, it brought no revelation. The search resumed with renewed determination, but less certainty. The idea that effort alone would solve this had begun to erode. Something else was at play, something effort could not reach. Investigators began to question not just where to search, but what they were searching for. If the men had been abducted, where was a sign of force? If they had left voluntarily, where was the preparation? If there had been an accident, where was the evidence? Each scenario collapsed under its own contradictions. The case took on a strange stillness. Activity continued, but progress did not. Maps filled with markings that led nowhere. Notebooks thickened with observations that produced no conclusions. The search, defined by motion, yielded only absence. What lingered after days of effort was a deep unease. Not fear exactly, but disorientation. The sense that the rules governing cause and effect had loosened. People are meant to leave traces. They are meant to be found, even if too late. The failure to locate anything, any sign at all, felt like a violation of that expectation. Eventually, the active search scaled back, not because hope was gone, but because there was nowhere left to look. The landscape had been exhausted. The roads, the buildings, the woods had all been asked the same question and returned the same answer. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of searching had been. It settled over the case, over the families, over the airport itself. The absence was no longer temporary. It had taken shape, defined not by what was found, but by what never would be. The search had been thorough. It had been earnest, and it had found nothing. When the search yielded nothing, the silence did not stay empty for long. It began to fill with voices, not official ones at first, but the quieter murmurs that rise whenever certainty disappears. In the absence of answers, people reach for explanations the way they reach for handholds in the dark. Speculation crept in slowly, almost politely, framed as concern rather than accusation. But once introduced, it refused to leave. At the airport, conversations shifted in tone. The language of logistics gave way to suggestion. Someone wondered aloud whether the pilots had argued with management. Someone else recalled a minor disagreement from months earlier, now reshaped into something heavier. These thoughts were offered cautiously, as if acknowledging their own fragility, but they lingered longer than facts ever had. With no evidence to anchor the story, imagination began to do the work. Outside the airport, the story traveled further and changed as it went. Local news outlets reported the disappearance with restraint, but viewers read between lines that were never written. 2 men vanished before flight. No signs of struggle. No trace. The framing invited questions. Talk radio hosts posed them openly, their voices confident, their conclusions unburdened by responsibility. Callers phoned in with theories sharpened by fear and curiosity. One idea emerged early and refused to fade, that the men had chosen to disappear. It appealed to a certain logic. Adults, after all, have agency. Pilots have access to travel. If anyone could slip away undetected, it would be someone who understands systems. The theory gained traction not because it was supported by evidence, but because it explained the absence. It turned mystery into intention. Those who floated this idea often pointed to the same imagined details: stress, burnout, secret dissatisfaction. Perhaps they had reached a breaking point together. Perhaps they had planned an exit, synchronized in silence. The story took on a conspiratorial elegance, a narrative neatness that real life rarely offers. It also shifted the weight of the disappearance, subtly transforming the men from victims into actors. Families bristled at the suggestion. To them, it felt like an erasure of the men they knew. They pushed back against the implication that loved ones would abandon children, partners, parents without a word. The pain of not knowing was already immense. The idea that the disappearance might have been deliberate added a layer of quiet accusation that felt cruel. Another theory followed close behind, darker and less forgiving: foul play, kidnapping, retaliation. Someone suggested the pilots had seen or known something they shouldn't have. Others whispered about criminal involvement, about hidden dealings that placed them in danger. These stories fed on a lack of information, growing more elaborate as they spread. Each retelling added details that felt convincing only because no one could disprove them. Within the airline, speculation was carefully contained, but it existed nonetheless. People replayed interactions, searching for missed signals. A tired expression, a sharp word, a moment of distraction. Ordinary human behavior was retroactively framed as warning. The idea that something might have been overlooked offered a strange comfort. It suggested that the disappearance was not random, that it followed rules that could, in theory, be understood. Investigators, too, were not immune to the pull of theory. With no physical evidence to guide them, they began testing possibilities against the available facts. Each scenario was examined, then quietly set aside. The men had not withdrawn money. They had not contacted anyone after disappearing. They had not used their knowledge of aviation systems in any detectable way. The theories explained the mystery emotionally, but not practically. Still, speculation continued, filling the space where answers should have been. Friends of friends offered insights, claiming insider knowledge that dissolved under scrutiny. Strangers mailed letters to authorities, outlining elaborate explanations built on coincidence and assumption. Every new idea briefly reignited attention, only to collapse when confronted with reality. The most unsettling effect of these whispers was the way they reshaped memory. As theories circulated, the past began to bend around them. People remembered events differently, colored by what they now believed might have happened. Certainty gave way to reinterpretation. The men themselves became less solid, their identities fractured by narrative. What made the stage of the disappearance particularly painful was its intimacy. Speculation felt invasive, reaching into private lives and rearranging them for public consumption. The pilots were no longer just missing. They were being rewritten. Their silence invited interpretation, and interpretation rarely remained kind or neutral. For the families, this period marked a shift from hope to defense. They found themselves protecting the reputations of men who could no longer speak for themselves. Each rumor required rebuttal. Each theory demanded emotional labor. Grief was no longer a private burden. It became a public argument. As time passed, the whispers hardened into categories. Some people believed the men had chosen to leave. Others were convinced something terrible had been done to them. A few clung to the possibility of accident, though no evidence supported it. These beliefs became identities, shaping how people spoke about the case and what they expected from it. The danger of speculation was not just that it might be wrong, but that it might feel right. In the absence of truth, coherence became seductive. A story, even an unproven one, offered relief from uncertainty. It allowed people to stop asking questions, to settle into explanation. But the disappearance resisted this settling. Every theory left too much unexplained. Why leave everything behind? Why together? Why without a trace? Why here, in this narrow window of time? The questions circled endlessly, unanswered. In the end, the whispers did not solve the mystery. They only deepened it. They added noise to silence, layers to absence. The case became not just about two missing men, but about the human need to explain what frightens us. And in that need, the truth, whatever it was, grew harder to reach, obscured by the stories people told to make the unexplainable feel less unbearable. For the families, time did not move the way it did for everyone else. It did not flow forward in a steady line. It looped, stalled, and folded back on itself. Days after the disappearance were spent in a suspended state, defined by waiting for phone calls, waiting for updates, waiting for something, anything, that would turn uncertainty into fact. The absence of information was not neutral. It pressed in from all sides, filling every quiet moment. At first, hope was practical. It lived in logistics and probability. Maybe the men were injured somewhere and unable to communicate. Maybe they were confused, disoriented, temporarily lost. The mind clung to scenarios that allowed survival. Families stayed close to phones, replaying the same thought again and again, convinced that vigilance itself might make a difference. Homes became command centers of a sort. Notes were taken. Schedules were abandoned. Normal routines dissolved under the weight of waiting. Meals went untouched. Sleep came in fragments. Every knock at the door triggered a jolt of adrenaline. Every unfamiliar number on the caller ID sent hearts racing. Even disappointment began to feel familiar, a rhythm as constant as breathing. As days turned into weeks, the nature of hope shifted. It became quieter, more fragile. No longer grounded in likelihood, it survived on imagination. Families pictured scenarios in which the men would walk through the door, thinner perhaps, shaken, but alive. These visions were not fantasies so much as lifelines, mental rehearsals for a reunion that felt necessary to survive the waiting. Children asked questions that cut straight through the careful language adults used. Where is he? When is he coming back? Why hasn't he called? There were no answers that did not wound. Families learned to speak in half-truths, to balance honesty with protection. They learned the weight of words like missing and don't know, how they lingered in the air long after being spoken. Birthdays arrived and passed. Anniversaries lost their meaning. Chairs at tables remained empty, not as symbols, but as practical reminders of absence. Families resisted making changes, as though rearranging furniture or discarding belongings might signal acceptance. Closets stayed full. Tools stayed where they were last left. The men's presence remained embedded in spaces they once occupied. Public attention brought a different kind of strain. Media inquiries arrived with condolences and questions, their interest sincere but relentless. Families learned to repeat the same details, to compress their grief into sound bites. Each retelling felt like reopening a wound that never had time to close. Privacy became a luxury they could no longer afford. As speculation grew outside, families felt increasingly isolated inside. They were forced to listen to theories about the men's choices, their motives, their possible secrets. These stories felt like intrusions, rewriting lives that had already been stolen by absence. Defending the men became a daily task, as exhausting as it was painful. The hardest part was the lack of ritual. In loss, there are usually markers, funerals, memorials, grave sites, moments where grief is acknowledged, shared, and given shape. In this case, there was nothing to anchor mourning, no body, no certainty, just a prolonged state of emotional suspension. Families existed in a space between hope and grief, unable to fully embrace either. Over time, the waiting changed people. Partners aged differently, carrying a tension that never fully released. Parents grew older with questions that followed them into sleep. Children matured with gaps in their understanding of the world, learning early that stability could vanish without warning. The disappearance became a defining event, shaping identities in quiet, persistent ways. Some family members held on to hope longer than others, and this difference created its own fractures. Belief and doubt coexisted uneasily within households. One person might still expect a call, while another began to prepare for the possibility that it would never come. These differences were rarely spoken aloud, but they were felt in the spaces between conversations. The years continued to pass, indifferent to unresolved stories. Life demanded participation. Bills needed paying. Children needed raising. Careers moved forward or stalled. Families learned how to function alongside absence, how to carry it without letting it consume every moment. But the weight never lifted. It simply became familiar. Holidays were especially difficult. Traditions once shared now felt incomplete, their repetition a reminder of who was missing. Families navigated these moments carefully, balancing remembrance with the need to move forward. Laughter, when it came, was tinged with guilt. Joy felt fragile, easily disrupted by memory. What endured most was the not knowing. It followed families into every decision, every milestone. Should they move? Should they change names? Should they declare death in the absence of proof? Each choice felt like a betrayal of possibility. As long as the men were missing, not gone, there was always a chance, however small, that answers might still arrive. The disappearance did not end when the search did. It settled into daily life, an uninvited companion. Families learned to live with questions that had no resolution, to exist in a state of emotional limbo that offered neither closure nor relief. They carried their loved ones forward not through memory alone, but through the ache of unanswered questions, a quiet testament to lives interrupted and a grief that refused to be contained by time. The case did not disappear, even when attention did. It settled into drawers and filing cabinets, into memories that resurfaced without warning. Officially, it became cold, a term that suggested stillness, dormancy, an end of movement. But in truth, it never stopped breathing. It lingered in the background, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone that it was unfinished. Years passed, marked not by answers but by distance. New staff replaced old ones at the airport. Schedules changed. Aircraft were retired and replaced. The world moved forward in ways that made the disappearance feel increasingly out of place, like a question asked in a room that no longer existed. And yet, for those who knew the story, it never fully receded. It hovered, unresolved, a quiet anomaly in an industry built on precision. Every so often, the file was pulled back into the light. Sometimes it happened because of a new investigator with fresh eyes, someone unwilling to accept that silence meant conclusion. Other times it was triggered by anniversaries, by media interest reignited through documentaries or articles that framed the case as one of enduring mystery. Each return of the case carried with a cautious optimism, the sense that time, paradoxically, might reveal what urgency could not. Documents were reviewed again, timelines reconstructed, old notes reread with the hope that something once dismissed might now appear significant. Investigators traced the same paths, revisited the same questions. Why no sightings? Why no evidence? Why this precise window of disappearance? The answers, stubborn as ever, refused to materialize. What did change with time was perspective. Details that once seemed insignificant took on new weight. A gap in a logbook, an incomplete report, a decision made quickly in the early hours that now appeared less certain. The passage of time did not provide answers, but altered the shape of the questions. The mystery evolved, shifting subtly with each reevaluation. Technology advanced, offering new tools, but no guarantees. Databases expanded. Records once inaccessible became searchable. Footage quality improved in general, though it could not retroactively sharpen the grainy images of past. The hope was that something, somewhere, had been missed, some trace that could now be found. Each technological leap rekindled belief that resolution was still possible. Families watched these renewed efforts with guarded emotion. Each reopening of the case stirred feelings they had learned to manage but never eliminate. Hope returned, cautious and restrained, tempered by years of disappointment. They learned to listen without expecting too much, to protect themselves from the cycle of anticipation and letdown. The case's persistence became a kind of presence. It resisted closure not through dramatic twists, but through its refusal to fade. It was mentioned in training sessions, in conversations among investigators, as an example of what could not be explained. It served as a reminder that even the most structured systems had blind spots, places where certainty could slip through unnoticed. What troubled those who revisited the case was not just a lack of answers, but the sense that something fundamental had been overlooked. Not a clue exactly, but a perspective. The disappearance did not behave like other cases. It did not escalate, unravel, or collapse. It remained static, suspended in the moment it began. This stillness felt intentional, as though the truth had been sealed off rather than lost. Occasionally, new information surfaced, an old employee recalling something odd, a document rediscovered during an audit. These moments sparked brief flurries of activity, each one scrutinized intensely. But none provided the breakthrough everyone quietly hoped for. Instead, they added layers to the story, complexity without clarity. The enduring nature of the case also changed how it was remembered. It became less about the specific men and more about what their disappearance represented. It was a cautionary tale, a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder that some questions resist resolution no matter how long they are pursued. The pilots became part of a larger narrative about absence itself. Yet, for all the abstraction, the human element never fully disappeared. Those who worked the case felt its weight, the frustration of effort without reward. They carried it with them, an unresolved chapter in their professional lives. Some spoke of it years later, still unsettled, still searching for meaning in its silence. The refusal of the case to stay buried was not dramatic. There were no sudden revelations, no decisive moments. Instead, it lingered through persistence, through memory, through the quiet insistence that something important remained unresolved. It survived because it had never been answered, and unanswered questions have a way of enduring long after everything else has moved on. In that persistence, the disappearance took on a new form. It was no longer just an event, but a presence, a reminder that time does not guarantee understanding, and that some mysteries remain alive not because they are unsolved, but because they refuse to be forgotten. For a long time, no one talked about the hangar, not because it was hidden, but because it was ordinary. It sat at the edge of the airport complex, functional and unremarkable, a structure people passed without thinking. It was older than most of the surrounding buildings, its purpose long reduced to storage, overflow maintenance, and tasks no one wanted to assign elsewhere. It blended into the background of daily operations, part of the scenery rather than the story. In the early days after the disappearance, attention had been everywhere else. Terminals, parking lots, roads leading away from the airport. The hangar was assumed to be irrelevant by virtue of familiarity. It was a known space, accessed by staff, governed by routine. There was no reason to suspect it held anything of interest, and so it remained unexamined, its presence taken for granted. Years later, when the case was revisited yet again, the hangar entered the conversation not as a revelation, but as a question. It surfaced during a routine review of maintenance records, the kind of dry paperwork that rarely inspires curiosity. An investigator noticed a gap, not in activity, but in documentation. Logs from a certain period were incomplete, not missing entirely, but thin, vague, the kind of oversight that could be explained by human error, but also by something more deliberate. At first, the details seemed minor. Airports generate mountains of paperwork, and inconsistencies are not uncommon. But the timing of the gap aligned too neatly with the disappearance to ignore. It was subtle enough to have escaped notice for decades, yet specific enough to raise eyebrows now. The hangar, long invisible, began to feel oddly present. Interviews followed, tentative and cautious. Former employees were contacted, many of them retired, some reluctant to revisit memories from so long ago. Their recollections were fragmented, shaped by time and distance. But a pattern emerged in the hesitations, the pauses before answers. People remember the hangar as a place of unusual instructions, a space that was occasionally closed without explanation, access that shifted unexpectedly, work orders that felt rushed. None of these memories were concrete enough to stand alone. Each one could be dismissed as routine irregularity, the kind that accumulates in any large operation over time. But together, they formed a texture of unease. The hangar had not been suspicious in a dramatic sense. It had been quietly different. What unsettled investigators most was not what people remembered, but what they didn't. No one could say with certainty who had been in charge of the hangar during that period. Oversight appeared diffuse, responsibility spread thin. In a system built on accountability, this lack of clarity felt wrong. The hangar existed in a kind of administrative shadow, just visible enough to function, but obscure enough to escape scrutiny. Physical changes to the structure added another layer of discomfort. Renovations had occurred shortly after the disappearance, framed at the time as necessary updates. Walls were reinforced. Storage configurations altered. Nothing that would have raised alarm on its own. Airports evolved constantly, adapting to new regulations and technologies. But the proximity of those changes to the event, when viewed through the lens of hindsight, felt uncomfortably precise. Investigators walked the space years later, guided by old blueprints and newer modifications. The hangar smelled of dust and oil, its air heavy with the residue of decades of use. Light filtered through high windows, illuminating corners where nothing seemed out of place, and yet everything felt slightly off. The building held its secrets well, offering no obvious signs of disturbance. What made the hangar different from other leads was its permanence. Roads change, businesses close, people move, but buildings endure. They witness events without comment, their silence neither confirming nor denying what has passed within their walls. The hangar had been there before the disappearance and remained long after, unchanged in its essential form. As attention focused more closely, questions multiplied. Why had the hangar been excluded from early search efforts? Why were certain records incomplete? Why did renovations occur when they did? None of these questions implied guilt on their own, but together they suggested omission rather than coincidence. The hangar began to feel like a space that had been politely ignored, not out of malice, but out of assumption. It was assumed to be irrelevant, assumed to be safe, assumed to be understood. That assumption, investigators realized, might have been a mistake. The idea that something so ordinary could hold significance was unsettling. It challenged the narrative of the disappearance as something that happened elsewhere, beyond the reach of immediate surroundings. It suggested that the answer might not be hidden in distant places, but embedded within the very environment where the story began. As this realization took hold, the hangar transformed in the imagination of those revisiting the case. It became less a building and more a symbol of overlooked space, of the dangers of familiarity. The place people stopped seeing was now the place they could not stop thinking about. Still, there was no proof, no evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Just a growing sense that the hangar had been too easily dismissed, its ordinariness shielding it from the kind of attention it now demanded. The case did not pivot on this realization, but it tilted, its balance shifting subtly toward a possibility that felt both inevitable and deeply unsettling. The hangar, long silent and unremarkable, had entered the story not as an answer, but as a question that refused to be ignored. The decision to open the wall was not driven by the case, at least not officially. It came wrapped in a language of routine maintenance, framed as a structural necessity rather than an investigative act. Decades had passed, and the building was due for inspection, its aging bones subject to the same scrutiny as any other part of the airport. Paperwork moved through departments, approvals were granted, and a date was set. No one involved could have said with certainty that they expected anything unusual to be found. When the work began, it did so quietly. Tools echoed softly in the cavernous space of the hangar, their sound swallowed by high ceilings and empty corners. Dust settled on the floor as panels were removed and surfaces exposed for the first time in years. The process was slow, methodical, unremarkable. It was the kind of labor that rarely intersects with history, let alone mystery. The wall in question had always been there. It blended seamlessly into the structure, its presence accepted without thought. It separated one section of the hangar from another, its purpose never questioned. No markings distinguished it from the rest. No sign suggested it had been added later or altered significantly. It was simply part of the building, as unremarkable as concrete could be. When the first section gave way, there was no dramatic reveal, no sudden discovery. Just a dark, narrow space behind it, long sealed from view. Air that had not circulated in years escaped into the hangar, carrying with it the smell of age and neglect. Workers paused, not out of fear but curiosity. The space was unexpected, not dangerous. At least not yet. As more of the wall was removed, the cavity revealed itself more clearly. It was not a room in a conventional sense, but a recess, a structural void that had been intentionally closed off. Its edges were rough, inconsistent with the rest of the building's design. Someone had chosen to seal it, to make it invisible. The realization settled slowly, accompanied by a growing unease. Authorities were notified, not because something specific had been found, but because the space should not have existed at all. The hangar's blueprints did not account for it. The omission was not dramatic, but it was precise. The void had no documented purpose. It was an absence within a structure already defined by absence. Investigators arrived with caution, aware of the weight such a discovery could carry. The hangar, long suspected but never proven relevant, now held a secret that had survived decades unnoticed. The space was examined carefully, every inch documented. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded. The process was deliberate, almost reverent. Inside, there were signs of human activity. Not overt, not theatrical, but unmistakable. Scuff marks where feet had once stood. Impressions where something heavy had rested against the wall. Small details that suggested the space had been used, however briefly. There were no remains, no definitive evidence that could close the case in a single moment. Instead, there was implication. Objects were found, their significance unclear at first glance. Items that might have belonged anywhere else, but felt wrong here. A fragment of fabric, a personal effect whose origin could not be immediately identified. These findings were treated with care, their presence documented without assumption. Each item was a question, not an answer. The absence of a body was, paradoxically, the most disturbing element. The space suggested confinement, concealment, purpose. And yet, it held no finality. It did not resolve the disappearance. It reframed it. The wall had not hidden a conclusion, but a possibility. It hinted at proximity to the pilot's final moments, without revealing what those moments had been. News of the discovery spread quickly, carried by the gravity of its implications. For families, it reopened wounds long managed but never healed. The idea that something physical had been hidden so close to where the disappearance began was both validating and devastating. It confirmed that the case had not been imagined, that something tangible had been overlooked. But it also denied closure, offering evidence without explanation. Investigators faced the uncomfortable task of interpreting absence. The space did not tell a story outright. It whispered fragments, leaving those who listened to assemble meaning from implication. The sealed wall suggested intent. The lack of documentation suggested omission. Together, they formed a narrative that was deeply unsettling, precisely because it resisted completion. The discovery forced a re-evaluation of the past. Decisions made decades earlier were reconsidered, assumptions revisited. The hangar, once dismissed as irrelevant, now stood at the center of the story. Its silence, preserved for 36 years, felt deliberate rather than incidental. What emerged from behind the wall was not the truth, but a reminder how easily truth can be hidden in plain sight. The space that existed within the everyday, unnoticed, unexamined, protected by its ordinariness. Its opening did not solve the mystery. It deepened it, transforming the disappearance from a question of where into a question of how. The wall, once open, could not be closed again. Its absence became as significant as its presence had once been. The hangar, long quiet, now carried the weight of implication, its empty space louder than any answer could have been. The discovery behind the wall did not bring clarity. It brought disturbance. For decades, the disappearance had existed in a kind of narrative stasis, suspended between speculation and silence. The open space shattered that balance. It did not answer the old questions so much as it forced new ones into existence, questions that reached backward and reshaped everything that had come before. Investigators returned to the original timeline with renewed urgency. Moments once dismissed as inconsequential were pulled apart and examined again, their meanings altered by the knowledge that something had been hidden in the hangar all along. The morning of the disappearance was no longer just a story of absence. It became a sequence of missed intersections, overlooked possibilities, and assumptions that now felt fragile. Every decision made in the early hours was reevaluated. Why certain areas were searched and others were not. Why the hangar had been considered too familiar to warrant suspicion. Why records had been accepted as complete when they were not. None of these questions accused specific individuals outright, but together they revealed a pattern of trust placed in systems that had quietly failed. The sealed space reframed the disappearance as something that may not have unfolded elsewhere, but right at the center of operations. The idea was deeply unsettling. It suggested that the pilots had not vanished into the unknown, but into the unnoticed, that they may have been close, painfully close, while everyone was searching outward. This shift in perspective altered the emotional tone of the case. What had once felt like a mystery defined by distance now felt claustrophobic. The absence was no longer vast and abstract. It was contained, enclosed, perhaps controlled. The airport itself transformed from a backdrop into a participant, its familiar spaces suddenly heavy with implication. Families struggled with this reframing. The discovery validated years of insistence that something had been overlooked, that the story had never fully made sense. But validation came at a cost. The idea that answers might have been hidden so close for so long was almost unbearable. It forced them to imagine scenarios they had avoided for decades, images that crowded the space where hope had lived. The men themselves were re-examined in light of this new context. Their final movements, once imagined as outward bound, were reconsidered as inward constrained. The possibility that they had never left the airport, that their disappearance had been immediate rather than prolonged, changed the emotional weight of their last moments. The unknown remained, but its shape shifted. Public perception followed a similar arc media coverage returned, this time more urgent, more accusatory. The narrative pivoted from mystery to omission, from what happened to why it had not been discovered sooner. Questions of responsibility surfaced, though answers remained elusive. The focus was no longer solely on the disappearance, but on the systems that had allowed it to remain unresolved. Investigators faced a difficult task of working backward through decades of memory and bureaucracy at a sharp word, a moment of distraction. Ordinary human behavior was retroactively framed as warning. The idea that something might have been overlooked offered a strange comfort. It suggested that the disappearance was not random, that it followed rules that could, in theory, be understood. Investigators, too, were not immune to the pull of theory. With no physical evidence to guide them, they began testing possibilities against the available facts. Each scenario was examined, then quietly set aside. The men had not withdrawn money. They had not contacted anyone after disappearing. They had not used their knowledge of aviation systems in any detectable way. The theories explained the mystery emotionally, but not practically. Still, speculation continued, filling the space where answers should have been. Friends of friends offered insights, claiming insider knowledge that dissolved under scrutiny. Strangers mailed letters to authorities, outlining elaborate explanations built on coincidence and assumption. Every new idea briefly reignited attention, only to collapse when confronted with reality. The most unsettling effect of these whispers was the way they reshaped memory. As theories circulated, the past began to bend around them. People remembered events differently, colored by what they now believed might have happened. Certainty gave way to reinterpretation. The men themselves became less solid, their identities fractured by narrative. What made the stage of the disappearance particularly painful was its intimacy. Speculation felt invasive, reaching into private lives and rearranging them for public consumption. The pilots were no longer just missing. They were being rewritten. Their silence invited interpretation, and interpretation rarely remained kind or neutral. For the families, this period marked a shift from hope to defense. They found themselves protecting the reputations of men who could no longer speak for themselves. Each rumor required rebuttal. Each theory demanded emotional labor. Grief was no longer a private burden. It became a public argument. Records were incomplete. Witnesses had aged or passed away. The physical environment had changed. The past could not be reconstructed perfectly, no matter how carefully it was examined. The discovery behind the wall offered a starting point, but not a path. What emerged instead was a sense of narrative instability. The case no longer held a single shape. It fractured into possibilities, each one challenging the assumptions that had once seemed solid. Accident, confinement, cover-up. Each theory carried new weight. None could be confirmed. The truth, whatever it was, remained just out of reach. The most difficult realization was that the discovery did not bring the case closer to resolution. In some ways, it pushed it further away. The more that was uncovered, the clearer it became how much had been lost to time. The wall had preserved a space, but not the context needed to understand it fully. And yet, the opening of the wall changed something fundamental. It proved that the disappearance had not been imagined, not misremembered, not exaggerated. Something real had been hidden, deliberately or not. The absence was no longer abstract. It had a location, a dimension, a physicality that could not be dismissed. In rewriting the story of the disappearance, the discovery forced everyone involved to accept a more unsettling truth, that answers are not always hidden far away, and that sometimes the most important questions are buried within the structures we trust the most. The case did not resolve. It transformed, and in that transformation, it became more haunting than ever. Even after the wall was opened, even after the hangar was pulled into the center of the story, the questions did not stop. They multiplied. The discovery promised answers, but delivered only a sharper awareness of how much remained unknown. What should have felt like progress instead felt like standing at the edge of something vast, unable to see how deep it went. There was no single moment investigators could point to and say, "This is where it happened." No definitive sequence of events emerged from the evidence. The space behind the wall suggested use, intention, and concealment, but it refused to explain itself. It did not say when it had been sealed or why, or by whom. It did not reveal how long it had been occupied, or what role it played in the disappearance. It simply existed, silent and unresolved. The absence of remains haunted every discussion. In cases of disappearance, physical proof often brings painful certainty. Here, certainty remained elusive. The lack of a body preserved hope for some and deepened anguish for others. It allowed the imagination to continue its work, filling gaps with possibilities that were often worse than answers. Were the pilots taken elsewhere? Were they alive after the wall was sealed? Did they ever leave the hangar at all? Each question circled endlessly, unanchored. Responsibility remained equally unclear. The discovery raised the possibility of human involvement, but stopped short of accusation. There was no clear evidence of cover-up, only evidence of omission. But omission can be accidental or deliberate, and the line between the two blurred with time. Records were incomplete, but incompleteness was common in an era before digital precision. Memories were unreliable. Intent was impossible to prove. This ambiguity frustrated everyone involved. Families wanted accountability, or at least explanation. Investigators wanted conclusions that could withstand scrutiny. The public wanted a narrative that made sense. None of these desires could be fully met. The case resisted resolution not through complexity alone, but through erosion. Time had worn away the edges where answers might have been found. The unanswered questions took on a life of their own. They lingered in conversations, resurfaced in articles, appeared in documentaries that promised insight but could only offer reflection. Each retelling emphasized the same tension, the proximity of the possible truth and the impossibility of reaching it. The disappearance felt both close and distant, intimate and abstract. For the families, this stage was uniquely painful. The discovery had reopened wounds that had partially scarred over, reintroducing hope only to complicate it. They were forced once again to confront decisions they had delayed for decades, whether to push for official declarations, whether to seek legal closure, whether to accept that some answers would never arrive. None of these choices felt right. The men themselves remained undefined by the truth of what happened to them. They were remembered through fragments, photographs, stories, habits frozen in time. Their disappearance had overshadowed their lives, reducing them in public memory to the way they vanished rather than how they lived. This reduction felt like another loss, quieter but just as profound. Investigators acknowledged, often privately, that the case might never be fully solved. This admission carried weight, not as a failure of effort, but as a recognition of limitation. Some mysteries persist not because they are unsolvable in theory, but because the conditions required to solve them no longer exist. Evidence decays. Witnesses fade. Context disappears. The unanswered questions became part of the legacy of the case. They defined it as much as any discovery or theory. They served as reminders of the fragility of systems meant to provide certainty. They highlighted how easily things can slip through unnoticed, how absence can persist even in the presence of scrutiny. What remained was not resolution, but awareness, the awareness that some truths do not reveal themselves neatly. That discovery does not always equal understanding. That closure is not guaranteed. Even after decades of searching, the case stood as a testament to uncertainty, its unanswered questions echoing louder than any conclusions ever could. In the end, the disappearance resisted being finished. It refused to settle into a single explanation or moral. It lingered, unresolved, asking the same questions it always had, now sharpened by the knowledge that something had indeed been hidden, and that even its revelation could not bring the certainty everyone had waited for. When everything that could be opened had been opened, when every question that could be asked had been asked again and again, what remained was silence. Not the sudden silence of shock or disbelief, but the deeper kind that settles after long effort, when there is nothing left to pursue except memory. The case did not end with resolution. It ended with acceptance of uncertainty, a quiet understanding that some stories conclude not with answers, but with echoes. The airport continued to function as it always had. Flights arrived and departed on schedule. Announcements filled the air and dissolved. New passengers walked the same corridors where the disappearance had once disrupted routine, unaware of what had unfolded there decades earlier. To them, the space was neutral, unmarked. The machinery of travel does not pause for memory, and yet the absence remained. For those who knew the story, the airport was no longer just a place of movement. It was a reminder of how easily normalcy can fracture. Every quiet morning carried the faint impression of that other morning, when two men failed to arrive and the day tilted in a way no one could immediately see. The runway still stretched outward, open and expectant, but it now held an invisible weight. The hangar, too, remained, its wall no longer sealed, its interior altered by knowledge. It stood as a physical reminder of overlooked spaces, of the danger of assuming that familiarity equals understanding. Even in its ordinariness, it had become charged with meaning. A place once passed without thought now carried a story that could not be undone. Families learned, over time, to live alongside the unresolved, not to make peace with it, but to coexist with it. They carried their loved ones forward through remembrance rather than resolution. They marked milestones in quiet ways, honoring lives defined by more than their disappearance. The ache remained, but it no longer demanded constant explanation. The story, as it entered public memory, softened into something less urgent but no less haunting. It became a cautionary tale told in low voices, an example of how certainty can slip away without spectacle. The lack of a conclusion did not diminish its impact. If anything, it deepened it. Unanswered questions have a way of lingering longer than solved ones. In time, new generations encounter the story without the immediacy of those who had lived through it. To them, it was history, a mystery from another era. But even at a distance, it unsettled. The idea that people could vanish within the structures meant to ensure safety and accountability challenged assumptions about control and visibility. What endured most was not fear, but humility. The case reminded those who encountered it that systems, no matter how precise, are built by humans and subject to human blind spots. That not every story bends toward clarity. That some absences are not meant to be filled. The finality, if it could be called that, came not from discovery, but from exhaustion, from the understanding that continuing to search for certainty where none existed would not bring peace. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of questions left open, of lives remembered. The disappearance did not close. It faded into the background of collective awareness, always present, never resolved. A story carried forward not because it was finished, but because it refused to be forgotten. And in that refusal, it found its lasting shape, not as a solved case, but as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be, and how deeply absence can echo long after the door closes.